A number of the officials who played vital roles in the response to the accident and trying to make certain that the crisis did not turn into a catastrophic health event also told me that they learned a whole lot that they didn't know at the time and wished that they had. And among those who told me they had learned a lot that they didn't know when they were making what were really life and death decisions were Dick Thornburgh, who was the governor of Pennsylvania. Thornburgh had to make the critically important decision about whether or not to order an evacuation of the area surrounding 3 Mile Island. Joe Hendry, who was the chairman of the NRC at the time and who really became a fall guy for the media, took a lot of the blame for all that went wrong. Henry read my book and sent me a very nice note, and he said, you know, this was really painful for me to read, and it was. But he said, it's a great book because it explains what happened and why. And there's a lot in there I wish I would have known at the time. And another who made the same kind of comment was Harold Denton. Harold Denton was a high-level staff member at the NRC who was sent to the side of the plant as the president's representative, President Carter's representative at 3 Mile Island, and he reported by telephone to President Carter twice a day. He also spoke with the governor, Governor Thornburgh, several times a day. He also met with the media, and in that capacity, he also became the trusted voice of not only the governor. Harold Denton was the only one at the NRC who the governor really trusted, and that was important because they worked together very closely. But more surprisingly, the people of central Pennsylvania who faced enormous decisions about whether or not to leave their homes, and Denton was a guy who they listened to, who they believed. And Denton also told me after the book came out, he said, yeah, there was a lot in there. He said, I didn't know that was going on. I didn't know, you know, Carter was doing this or the commission was doing that. And what's important, first I found it interesting that, you know, I found things that they didn't know about. But what's important is that what I had in my book was important to know. It was important information. When my book came out, I was asked to give a lecture to the entire agency, a 45-minute summary of my 300-page book, which is always a little difficult. But it was important to do, and the agency's staff filled the auditorium at which I gave my talk. And they didn't have to. You know, it was a voluntary action on their part. And after I gave my talk, one of the 5 commissioners who head the NRC made this comment. He said, quote, "We are very lucky as an agency to have a resident historian. Some outside the agency, in the government and elsewhere, might think it is an unnecessary luxury. But I think anyone who has read Sam's book recognizes that this is a valuable investment in understanding our past and helping us to make a better future." And I appreciated that. I mean, I felt really good about that. I still do, as a matter of fact. Another comment that was very gratifying, another episode that was gratifying for me, and I hope helps to underscore the importance of an agency history program, also came from a comment from Harold Denton, about whom I just spoke. Harold was who died just a couple of months ago, the late Harold Denton, was a nuclear engineer. And in 2009, the NRC held a day-long program at the agency headquarters to mark the 30th anniversary of the 3 Mile Island accident. And it invited back Denton and Governor Thornburgh, Jessica Matthews from the Carter White House, and other veterans of the accident. They talked about their memories and their experiences. And at lunchtime, in that day-long meeting, we had a luncheon, and I was standing outside of the room where the luncheon was held with Denton and Thornburgh and a couple of other people. And Denton kind of said out of the blue, he certainly was not prompted by me, out of the blue he said, you know, when the NRC established a program, a history program in 1978, I thought it was a waste. I thought it was a waste of an FTE that could better be used for, or could better be used by hiring a resident inspector for a plant, by hiring a technical person. and not to use an FTE on a historian. And then he went on to say, he said, but I was wrong. He said, based on the work that the history program has done since it was established in 1978, I think the history program is a major asset to this agency. And of course, I appreciated that very much. But it speaks, I think, to what we can provide as federal historians that others simply don't do. I wish to emphasize that Denton did not make that comment because I was uncritical of the NRC or its policies and programs in my book on 3 Mile Island or any of the other books that I wrote as NRC historian. And in fact, some of the most favorable reviews that I received of my 3 Mile Island book were written by longtime critics of nuclear power in the NRC. Rather, Denton and others seem to recognize that a history program is a great asset only if it is written according to high professional standards and if it tells a story, warts and all. And that is why I insist that honest history that separates lore, myth, and faulty memories from fact is essential for any agency or institution. It is also why I insist that the charge of court history is so ill-founded, so ill-informed, and so dismissive, and a better word is probably ignorant, of the value of historical knowledge beyond teaching and other academic pursuits. Well, writing and publishing books on the history of the NRC was far from my only duty as agency historian. One of those duties, at least for a while, was to write background papers on issues of current interest to the commissioners. And this came about because in the early 1990s, the NRC got a new chairman who was a very bright guy. He had and still has 2 PhDs, very quick study. And he came to the NRC as chairman without knowing much about a nuclear power or about a nuclear power regulation. And so shortly after he got there, he said that he would like to have a series of background papers, short papers written on the topics that he was dealing with, along with the other commissioners, on a current basis. And you might think as the agency historian that I stood up and said, yes, that's me, I would be glad to do that. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. I tried to hide, and they found me. And within a short time, against my will and over my protests, I was writing a series of background papers on issues of current interest. And at first, these started off as 5 or 6 page papers, which is what I was told to do or what I was advised to do originally. And it quickly became apparent that these simply weren't adequate, so the background papers quickly grew into 25 or 30 page papers. And that was fine. And then one of the topics on which I was asked to write was a history of radiation protection. Radiation protection, of course, is the primary duty of the NRC. We had published, George and I had published one book by that time, and I had published a second. So in those 2 books that had been published to date, I'd written a couple of chapters in each on radiation protection, so it was something that I knew something about, unlike a lot of the other topics I was doing background papers on, and also one that I was interested in. So as I did research on this paper, it quickly grew from 30 pages to 160 pages. And that was fine with people. They seemed to enjoy it, and one day I kind of realized, hey, I've got the basis for a book here. So I fleshed it out, and I got it published in the year 2000 as a history of radiation protection in the 20th century by the University of California Press. So in that sense, the background papers had a very happy outcome for me, one that I certainly did not anticipate when I started. But the more important part of this story is that people at the NRC loved the papers. And I hope they loved them because they were good, but they loved them in any event. The chairman, who had gotten me involved in these papers, called me, quote, the Hemingway of science writers, which might have been a slight exaggeration. But again, the point is he loved the papers. He loved the papers because they gave him background information on the issues that he was dealing with that were crossing his desk every day. And so the papers helped him to better understand what he was dealing with. And he was not a technical person. He did not want the technical papers, which was good because I could not have provided them. But what he did want was something that kind of outlined what the issues were, what the background was, and he found them, apparently from all he said, enormously useful. And the other NRC commissioners and the NRC staff also received them very favorably. So in terms of the status of my program, the visibility of my program, the credibility of my program, the papers were very good for me and what I did and for my stature within the agency. So in that sense, they were a good thing, but I was still really, really happy when that assignment ended. Among the other duties that I performed as NRC historian, like all of you, was responding to queries from the public, from agency staff, and from the media. And I won't go into detail on this because you all know how that goes. But I do want to talk very briefly about one incident that I think in a very obviously practical way underscores the value of a history program. One day I received a call from a lawyer with the staff of the Office of the General Counsel, and she asked me about the location of the regulatory staff when it had been a part of the Atomic Energy Commission. The AEC was a predecessor of the NRC. When the NRC was created, it took over the regulatory duties, the responsibility for regulating nuclear power and other uses of nuclear fission. So the AEC's regulatory staff was the predecessor of the NRC, and she was asking me where the AEC's regulatory staff had been physically located. And the reason she asked me was that the NRC was involved in a hearing or a lawsuit of some kind with a company in St. Louis, and the company in St. Louis wanted the trial to be held in St. Louis instead of in Maryland. And the case that it made was that the NRC's regulatory staff, the AEC, was not based in Maryland. It was headquartered in Washington, D.C., and so therefore there was no reason to hold the hearing or trial, I'm not sure what it was, a legal proceeding in Maryland. So she asked me where the regulatory staff had been located, and she said, was it in Maryland? I said, yes, because it was. And I said, I can give you plenty of documents, I can give you plenty of evidence. It's just absolutely true that at the time of this alleged violation, the AEC's regulatory staff had been based in Bethesda, Maryland. So she called me back a few days later, and she said she wouldn't need the evidence, that the judge, that she had contacted the judge and told him what I'd said, and he said, well, that's good enough for me. That's all I need. The word of the NRC historian is all I need, and as a result, the hearing was not moved to St. Louis at a potentially considerable savings in money and inconvenience to the NRC staff. And what struck me about this were two things. One, I'm sure the judge didn't know me from Adam, but he accepted the word of a historian because I was a historian. And it speaks to how much credibility we have beyond the halls of academe and beyond the halls of the agencies for which we work. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. The other thing was that it underscored, in my mind, the practical value of a history program. It is one shot and done, but that, at least for that lawyer, the one shot was very, very important. Well, I hope that my experiences with the NRC underscore the fact that federal historians, what we do is to perform a variety of functions that have great practical value. We do it without sacrificing professional integrity and in accordance with high professional standards. Our work goes far beyond addressing and conversing with other historians. We simply don't have that luxury. By necessity, our work has to be accessible and useful to a wide array of audiences other than historians who draw on our skills and our expertise to better understand the problems that they face or to answer the questions that they have. In an age of so-called fake news and alternative facts, what we do is more important than ever, and the responsibilities that we carry out are more essential than ever. The need for honest, accurate, and accessible history for federal agencies and the public we serve has never been greater. And the practical worth of what we do should receive a ringing affirmation from all those who place a high value on facts, accuracy, context, and considered judgment. And I wish all of you who are practicing the historical profession in the federal government Godspeed in carrying out these very, very important responsibilities. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer questions.
Okay. Questions? Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions, so if anybody has any questions for Dr. Walker.
So I convinced you, huh? Yeah. Yes.
There's a microphone down at the bottom of the stage.
It must be difficult to be a one-person historian shop, and I'm surprised at what you were able to accomplish just as one particular individual. Did you have any other support that you could draw upon within the NRC that helped you with administrative, bureaucratic, and those other types of issues, or freed you up with the time that you needed to do the research and so forth?
Yeah, I had a lot of support. I mean, I didn't have to worry about the bureaucratic things, and I didn't have to hire anybody, and I was part of the office of the secretary, so all those things were taken care of. I had a lot of wonderful research assistants from contractors who I hired from Phil Canelon's company, History Associates Incorporated, and did a lot of the research for me. And then, as I asked them to do, they would write up papers about what they found, kind of background papers. They were kind of the Hemingways of contract history. So yeah, I did have support, and the NRC was careful, and I always appreciated this, that they thought that working on my books was so important that they pretty much left me alone. I mean, I got involved in doing other things. The background papers was only one example, but they also thought that I should be allowed to do my work, even if my work was sitting there staring out the window while they were running around with their hair on fire for something that had to be done, you know, in that exact moment. So yeah, I had good support and good appreciation for what I did, and from all the feedback I got, the NRC thought the books were just really important, and they were also, and this might be incidental and might not, but the books were also a source of pride for the agency, and I took great